In order to explain the apparent stagnation of living standards before the Industrial Revolution, we're going to turn to an economist that wrote in the early 19th century named Thomas Malthus. And Malthus's model was basically the idea that living standards unfortunately can't increase in the long run. And the reason for that is that if living standards do increase in the short run, either because there's a good harvest or because there's a new technology, then population expands. And because of the law of diminishing average product of labor, because those additional workers will not be able to produce as much as the earlier workers, then their income will fall. The average product of labor will fall back to where it was before. And living standards will be forced down to the subsistence level, just meaning, people get as much as they need to live, but not much more. And therefore, population and what we now call GDP per capita will stay constant. And this was a powerful idea, a powerful model, and it really does seem to describe the world before the Industrial Revolution. But interestingly, of course, the Industrial Revolution was happening right as Malthus was writing, so that while he was correct for the previous, 2,000 years of human existence, and even before then, he was wrong for the next 200 years. And it's a reason why, people like Adam Smith are better known than Thomas Malthus. So what happens if we get an improvement in technology? Basically, he says, all right, well, we have an improvement in technology. And it's, even though, we think of the Middle Ages, we often call them the Dark Ages, there were improvements in technology that happened. Um, then what happens is that average output per farmer rises, farmers' incomes rise. That means there's more food. And because there's more food, the population rises. And I think one of the things that's important to remember about the world before the Industrial Revolution is that infant mortality was very high. Uh, you know, Women died in childbirth all the time. Diseases would kill people all the time. And so more food meant people were healthier, people were stronger, and so population would go up. All right, well, if population goes up, that means there's less land per farmer or less good land per farmer. That means the average output per farmer falls and farmers' incomes fall. And another important thing to remember about this world is that almost everybody is a farmer, right? Almost everybody is spending the bulk of their time growing the food that we need to survive. And so, in the short run, we might get this increase in living standards. In the long run, those disappear because of the rise in population. And so, population goes up, but wages or GDP per capita does not. So if we think about, a Malthusian economy, we can graph this with the real wage on the vertical axis here and population on the horizontal axis. And we can see that, if the wage is high, the population is low, but then we're going to get pushed back to low wage and a medium population. And we can think about that in terms of population growth as well, that as when the real wage is higher, population is growing faster. When the real wage is lower, population is falling because people don't have enough food to eat, people are dying faster. And so what we're going to see when we look at some of this data is that, A is sort of an equilibrium, right? Whereas B is an outlier. And so if we're at A and we get pushed up to B because of a new technology, then population rises and the real wage is going to fall back to subsistence level. So what happens? How can we think about this? Well, a new technology, right, might shift up uh, the curve and lead to a higher wage at that population. But that means that the population is rising, right? Because we have a higher wage, which means that we get pushed back down along the wage curve, and we end up with a permanently higher population but a lower wage, right? And so, really, the question is the increase in productivity something that is temporary, right? We just had a good harvest because of good weather. Maybe we had 3 or 4 or 5 years of good weather in a row, and so population went up. But then we have 5 years of bad weather and population goes back down. Or did it increase because of a new technology, in which case it would be permanent, in which case we'd have a permanently higher population, but the wage is going to fall back to subsistence anyway. And so we can see this, Britain is one of the places where we have pretty good data going back all the way to the 13th century. And we can see that uh, after the Black Death in the 1340s, population fell, right? Average real wage went up, which makes sense because the Black Death didn't do anything to the land or to capital, right? So now these workers were more productive. Their wage went up, and their wage went up by a lot, right? So look at the difference between the 1350s and the 1490s. This is a real wage index, meaning we're comparing it to 1860, which is equal to 100. In the 1350s, it was only about 60% of the wage in 1860, but by the 1490s, it was over 90% of the 1860 wage. But then, right, so now we're at a high point of real wage and low population, but now population starts to recover, right? The bubonic plague is controlled, the bubonic plague leaves, and we move back down the curve. So in the 16th century, moving back down, and by the 1600s, right, we're not any better off than we were in the 1340s before the bubonic plague. We have the same number of people back again, and the wage is exactly the same. So it really looked like we were in this Malthusian trap, and there was no way to escape it. And so we can see, what happened here in this time frame, between 1300 and 1600. We had this horrendous event of the Black Death, which wiped out a huge amount of the population all over Europe after coming from China, where it did a very similar thing. That meant that there was more and better land per farmer. It also meant that peasants were more powerful. There was something called the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 that gave them some more rights, gave them some higher wages. Wages went up, right? So they reached a high, in the 1400s. But then as the population recovered and rose again, that meant there was less land per farmer, and that the bargaining power for farmers and peasants fell, and incomes basically went back to where they were before the Black Death. So why are we sometimes stuck in the Malthusian trap? Well, there are sort of three required conditions. One is the diminishing average product of labor, which we already talked about, right? The fact that as you add more workers, the average product of labor falls. The other is that you get a rising population in response to increases in wages. And we explain that by saying, listen, this was, before the healthcare revolution, more food meant healthier people. That meant people were going to survive more. That meant an increase in population. And an absence of improvements in technology that would offset the diminishing average product of labor. So the way we're going to think about technology is not that we move along, that the shape of the production function changes, but that it shifts up. And so really these new technologies that were introduced in the Industrial Revolution allowed people to escape the Malthusian trap by just producing so much more. And as we'll see, population sort of responded um, in a different way, right? So that now people, as they get richer, have fewer children rather than more children. So really the escape from the Malthusian trap, you can say, production sort of started increasing in the middle of the 17th century, but wages didn't really start increasing until the 19th century. But you can see that from about 1800 to 1860, wages increased by 40 to 50%, going from 72% of what they were in 1860 to 100%, obviously by 1860. So another interesting question is, all right, well, if production increased starting in around 1650, why didn't wages increase until around 1800, right? And they didn't really start increasing quickly until, 1830, 1840. And this is where institutions really become important. And so as productivity increases, workers are producing more and more, right? So we start moving from farms to factories. Farms are producing more, factories are producing more. And now that means that workers are able to demand more, their bargaining power increases, they're able to pass some laws such as no child labor under 9 years. Eventually, we get rid of child labor, limit the amount of time they can work. We get voting rights for all men, then we get voting rights for all people, and that allows people to capture more of what they are producing, right? Which hadn't been happening in the sort of previous 200 years.